South Euclid United Church of Christ. This is Wondering Wednesdays. We have been moving through our book as a part of our Lenten devotional, This Here Flesh. And I hope that it's been a blessing to you. The cool part about filming these is you really can read at your own pace. I've kind of kept certain disciplines for us as we move us along. Listen, today we're supposed to discuss chapters 14 and 15. But the way that chapter 14 arrested me, it gives me an opportunity to share a little bit further about some things that I think we're doing and some directions we're moving here in terms of the church. And so today, this section won't be too long, but I just want to focus on chapter 14, which is on memory. And so it's a really powerful chapter. As you know, it opens up with the conversation around her being identified as Kenyan and then being rejected because she is American. But I really appreciate the ways in which Cole Arthur Riley really fleshes out memory and why it's important. And as the book as a whole offers to us intergenerational connectivity, right? We're really hearing 3 generations of stories in one. We're hearing her grandmother's story, her father's story, and then her story. But she also lets us know on page 171 that without memory, we are forced to rely solely on ideas and suggestions to make sense of who we are as opposed to the concrete. And I don't know about you, but so often when I think back maybe on my childhood and I'm trying to fill in certain thoughts and questions that I have, there are these gaps in memory. Or I shared in a sermon a couple of months ago how there was a raging trauma through our house around a skateboard where my sister broke her arm. And Lindsay and I have the reaction of our mother and her sensing out, if there was a skateboard in the neighborhood, cemented in our minds, right? But when we brought this to her, she had no memory of it. Or I think about how Pastor Michelle Humphrey put out a Facebook post the other day, that as she has been walking with people through healing and helping them deal with trauma, she said, some parents need to apologize to their children. And what I find sometimes is that they don't remember. People don't remember the traumas. And so there are these gaps in memory. And without memory, Cole Arthur Riley is right. We just have to go off ideas and suggestions. So to have that concrete memory in our minds, I think really is critical. I appreciate how, she really fleshes out the importance of the duality of memory. Now, she doesn't use that language of duality in memory, but I do think she's making an assertion. So on page 175, there's this whole narrative that I was just not anticipating, where, as you know, the grandmother had been raped by the foster father, right? And that child given up for adoption. And Cole reveals that the wife of that baby she gave up for adoption reached out to her, and how they began, to build this relationship. And she talks about how whose story gets told. I mean, she had given this child up in an attempt to give that child a better life. And also because of the manner in which that child was conceived, right? But then the child had been told that the mother had abandoned him. And so, and that she was a no good mother. And so it says, I'm going to kind of skim from page 175. It says, in many spaces, to foster collective memory well, we must habitually ask ourselves whose story gets told, whose story is believed, and who gets to tell it. If we surrender our individual egos, these questions can function as a pruning process as we contend with accounts that don't line up quite flush. He goes on to say that he grew up thinking his mother left him on the church's front steps. He grew up thinking his mother was a heathen who left him when she was really 15 trying to save him, right? So there's this, so let's talk about this duality of memory. So, there is what happened, right? The memory that the mother has of what happened. I endured a trauma. I did this for your betterment. There is what he has been told. And whether it's true or not, is a duality in and of itself. This is what he has come to believe and holds in his memory as truth, right? Believing his mother left him and was a heathen, right? Okay, now watch this memory. My grandma met him. He started coming to Thanksgiving and family gatherings for a while. She tried. I believe she tried. Here's the memory. But his face, he looks just like him. I look at him, but I'm not seeing him, the son. The memory of the man clung to her. How can you be a mother to the same face that haunts you? So, it is this duality in that there are the memories of the son, there are the memories of the mother, but the mother cannot escape that when she looks at the son, it's the memory of the man who assaulted her. And so part of also what's happening here is that Cole Arthur Riley is helping us understand complexity. That memory is complex. It's not simple. It's not always accurate. Sometimes there are gaps in the story, for us. So she goes on to say he heard a different story. Excuse me. He heard a different story all his life. These things cannot be easily undone. Complexity. I'm not quick to blame him. The truest memory is rarely the one that survives. In most of our contexts, intellectual, charismatic, white, heterosexual, cisgender men will carry some weight subconsciously as keepers of history. It is important to name this tendency, for it has been systematically ingrained in us by societies that value their wealthiest, most visible, and most power-possessed members. This is key. First of all, it's called history, his story. It is not her story, right? It is his story. Who is his? His is not anybody. His are, as she lays out, white, cisgender, heterosexual males. I think that this is really important because so often we will even judge the Black community based off of a subconscious idea that white is right. The other piece that is coming up here for me is how important it is for us to tell our own story, and that we have the opportunity to do that, to name that, to claim that, and to face that sometimes there's a duality. So this is even why, for example, why in many contexts, the conversation right now of African American history, race and gender issues being eliminated, race primarily, from the educational system, right? So there's a video circulating on the internet about a woman whose child lives in Pennsylvania, and rather than saying that Black people were slaves, she said Black people were servants. That is not an accurate undertelling of history. But oftentimes what we're really hearing is that there is a particular group of people who want to alter the narrative. And we must fight for the true narrative to be told. They weren't just servants. They weren't indentured servants. They were slaves, captured from one land, brought to this land, and brutally treated, not paid, left with scraps, children torn apart. You gotta be mindful that there's a larger initiative here for whatever is white memory to be dominant memory. Okay? Now, one of the things, and this is kind of why I wanted to just focus on this piece today, because I deeply appreciate how Cole Arthur Riley interviews her family. And so I want to kind of read this because I just want to go somewhere and use it as an opportunity to kind of clarify some mission and direction here. So she says, I'm on page 179. She says, 3 years ago, I began collecting stories before it was too late. I was sitting next to my father in the car and staring at his hands when it occurred to me that I had never stared at them at all. It's difficult to explain precisely what struck me about this, but it was in that moment that I resolved to begin the long task, or more rightly, the long habit of collecting. I interviewed him first. It lasted 3 hours. I made sure it was on video so my children's children would not just remember the stories, but remember him telling them. The way his hands cut through the air in meaningful arcs, his pursed lips, the eye roll, even grin laced with shame. Some of him, of course, will not relent to be preserved on video. I hope those are the things that find themselves preserved in me. Few would deny that storytelling is the core to what it means to be human. Perhaps this reflects something of our Maker. God asks us more than one time to remember, to put the Lord in remembrance, Isaiah 62:6, to do this in remembrance, Luke 22:19, to, quote, tell your children of it and let your children tell their children. So I brought this up because, as I tried to help us lean into visual storytelling from the pieces in Bali, the pieces in Santorini, but even as recent as the piece with Dr. Edgar Jackson, I have been working with our grant writer, and I kind of mentioned that we're applying for this grant in hopes that we don't have to tap the congregation for a capital campaign, and we can really make this investment in media and in storytelling. And as I am helping people to tell their own story, so of course we've seen Dr. Jackson, but we told the story of the Sims family, or we told the story of Dr. Martina Moore and her family, Reverend Otis Moss Jr. We have so many people whose stories we've told from here. It causes me to look more closely at my own story. So how am I the way that I am? And why am I the way that I am? And the other week, the Spellman Messenger came to the house. I think it's quarterly, but it's a quarterly journal that comes from the college. And I sat down. I had a little bit of open time, and so I sat down and I was reading through the Spellman Messenger. And an article came up that said SIS, S-I-S, was celebrating 20 years of service on Spellman's campus. SIS stands for Spellman's Independent Scholars. And SIS was a program that was held by a woman by the name of Dr. Gloria Wade Gales. And Dr. Gales, in her first year of this program, and I was a part of it the first year, or the second year, I was a second year student in the program, was an oral histories project. She had been doing some work down in New Orleans and saw the richness that the women there had, the older women had to offer, and was wondering, how do we kind of collect these and pull them together? And so I joined this extracurricular activity, and I got to interview a woman by the name of Mitchell, and Reverend Mitchell. And back then I didn't realize what a giant she was. She was one of the first black women majorly ordained to a Baptist denomination, and Ella Mitchell, that was her name, Dr. Ella Mitchell. And, I sat down with her over coffee for 3 or 4 interviews, and I interviewed her. And I'm sharing this with you in 2 parts. Number one, because I didn't realize then God was starting the molding process for what we're doing now. Memory. But in addition to that, I have thought about how it wasn't just the notion of oral histories, right? It was even the fact that back then God was beginning to develop my interview skills, which when you take the piece we did with Dr. Jackson and how tender that interview required me to be, because I went into it with a lot of trepidation. I didn't want to trigger this man. I did not want to be a part of his mental health downfall or spiraling. But how do we tell a very tragic story with room for his story to be told, but pastorally care for him and not want to overwhelm him? And I think that the formation of those skills were happening at that time, and it comes through memory. But I want to take that a step further as we talk about, storytelling and living testaments in particular, because as I was working with the grant writer, who's just done an exceptional job of really helping me to gain even more clarity around, what is it? We say living testaments, ordinary people, remarkable stories. But what this is it's an oral history. Now, this is important because, I don't have one here with me, but, we should never forget that before the Bible was written, oral history is how the stories of the Bible were preserved. And what has happened is they went from oral telling, to then transcribing, writing it down, right, in a biblical format. Hear this. And because we could each eventually, right, because the initial Bibles, that wasn't the case, but because we can each own our own Bible, we often become wed to the Word, but the Word can only be written after it has been passed down through oral history from generation to generation to generation. So I ended up saying to the grant writer, Tina, I'm proposing something new, but I'm really proposing that we return to the roots of the oral history tradition, which is how our faith has been birthed. I'm going to read you just a couple of things from the draft. We're in the rough draft of the grant preparing for May, but our over 5 years with emphasis on building, testing, and scaling the storytelling experience locally, nationally, and globally. Pastor Jenkins and the Living Testament team will leverage video and film to highlight and bring to life the deep wisdom and tradition of God's power in everyday people, by evangelizing the living testimony of how the Holy Spirit is at work in chapter and verse in people's lives, right? And so we're really looking at exactly, I think that in this biblical sense, because it's the Bible, because it's an oral history, oftentimes big characters are the ones whose stories are told. We also know, and it's not a Bible, also we know that in the Bible, there were stories that were edited, stories that were left out, stories that were skewed. Pastor, how can you say that? Because in the Bible, so few times are women's names mentioned. Why? Because in that culture, their testimony was not valid. It didn't count. So they had no say. So if we take a story like Elijah with the widow who is coming and gathering sticks so her and her son can go home and die, they didn't grab that story from the widow, which is why we never get a name. They grabbed that story from Elijah, who likely told that story, or his assistant told that story, and it got passed down from generation to generation. So what we're trying to do with Living Testaments is to resurrect memory. And I think this is important for you to hear this. And so we say that where the Old Testament's primary witness is the work of God, the New Testament's witness is the work of Christ and the incubation of the church. Living Testaments will share the powerful testimony of how the Spirit is alive and powerfully walking alongside everyday people. There's a poem that we quote here, not the whole poem, it's quite long, but you've probably heard this saying, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. Did you know it was a part of a longer poem by Edgar Guest? Portions of the poem say, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one should walk with me than merely tell the way. I soon can learn to do it if you'll let me see it done. I can watch your hands in action, but your tongue too fast may run. And the lecture you deliver may be very wise and true, but I'd rather get my lessons by observing what you do. For I might misunderstand you and the high advice you give, but there's no misunderstanding of how you act and how you live. I mean, I want you to understand that what is happening with Living Testaments is an opportunity, if you will, to take the preacher as central and the text as central, not every Sunday, but a couple Sundays throughout the year, and allow you to see what does look like living into scriptures. You know, I'm taking Dr. Jackson because it's our most recent example. You know, you got to hear from a man who is, I think he's 84 or 89, one of the two. I think he's 84. And you got to hear from a man who's lost his wife and his birth children. You get to witness, I once was young, but now I'm old, and I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor its seed begging for bread. You got to see him sit there and laugh with Lisa to know no eye has seen and no ear has heard what is in the heart of those who love me. You got to hear his story of come to the water and God telling him that, and going back to Psalm chapter 1, I think it's Psalm chapter 1, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul thirsts after thee. You know, part of what we're trying to do here is what Cole Arthur Riley is talking about, the embodiment of Scripture, the embodiment of memory, the courage to tell the story. So on Monday, I had a meeting with Senator Sherrod Brown, and I entered the room for the meeting, and I had made the dangerous assumption that the meeting was all clergy. I was the only clergy person there. And as I walked in, someone said to me, you know, you're seated at Senator Brown's table. And I thought, oh, Lord. And then I come to find out I'm seated like right next to him, and he's my talking buddy for the entire luncheon. But as I moved through the room, there were so many people who ran up to me. Watch this. There were no members from our church in that room. But in that room, people ran up to me because they had either heard about the piece with Dr. Jackson, someone had sent it to them, this was my doctor, I knew parts of the story, I didn't know all of the story. Somebody said, you know, when people are having a rough day, I tell them about Dr. Jackson, but now they said, now I don't have to tell them. You've given me the gift that I can send them something so that they can actually see him in the flesh. Or when I was sharing this with him, hey, Dr. Jackson, generations to come should be able to pull this up on YouTube and see you telling this story. And I believe there's a man in 2060, 2080, who is gonna need your story. And so I thought this was a perfect time to kind of encapsulate what is the broader picture here. I mean, even as we did the work in Bali, because part of this vision is for global immersion and for storytelling, and even in this grant, our intergenerational pieces where we want to teach young people how to tell stories as an anchoring of them to the future of the church, right? To give them a skill set beyond singing or playing an instrument that gives them something to work with. And so it is this intergenerational memory and connectedness. It's where I said to you, I didn't think about how the film crew would be impacted, right? And so before us are these opportunities to really make this happen. Let me just read to you this last quote, because, we're on this sermon series moving through intention, and we've been working on our intention. So let me give you part of our working intention. So it's not final yet, but what makes Living Testaments unique is both the theory and praxis of digital storytelling as compelling preaching. It is the program's intention to recruit, train, inspire, and immerse preachers from large and small institutions, religious peers from other faiths, and lay staff to understand and build on the deep history and wisdom of traditional forms of communication while applying in real time new and creative avenues for pastoring in the modern age. Living Testaments is an ode to memory. And it's an opportunity to make sure that ordinary people get to tell their remarkable stories. And so I just want to encourage you this week to think about your own story. And it's Women's History Month. I just want to close with this. Prior to going on sabbatical, I started to wonder a lot about my grandmother, my mother's mother. I have a lot of memory of my father's mother and going with him to care for her. But my grandmother, my mother's mother, was sick most of my childhood when she was alive. So I don't have memories of all of her full and active and alive. She had really suffered some strokes at that point where I have conscious memory. And I share this with you because I'm really in the search for a deeper understanding of my grandmother, because my grandmother went to Howard University and my mom went to Purdue University, which makes Lindsay and I third generation college graduates, which unfortunately still is not every family story. We still have Black folk who are going off to college and they are first generation college graduates. And when I went to Lindsay's swearing in, I really sensed my grandmother in that room. My grandmother, Nancy Martha Humphrey, and these are the things that I do know, not only went to Howard, she was the first Black female CPA in the state of Ohio. And I lament that we don't have more history, more memory about who she was and what she overcame to arrive there. When my grandmother retired, she worked for the IRS here in Cleveland over the audit department. And I think if we just process for a minute, what does it mean for a Black woman in that day and age? Now, what's interesting about this job is just to kind of put it in a time period piece. And these are the parts of stories I'm starting to piece together. So I'm starting to do a little bit of research and ask some more questions of my family. But she really wanted this job as a head auditor, right? But the job was never written with women in mind. So this is probably, I'm guessing, in the 50s, 60s, it's a guess, maybe 50s is probably more like it. But anyway, the job was written for a man. And back then, my grandfather, who was an electrician, was married to my grandmother, right, CPA. And my grandmother came home one day and said, George, I really want this job, but I don't qualify. And he said, what do you mean you don't qualify? And she said, you have to be able to drive. Put it in time period piece. So back then, women didn't drive. Not that women couldn't drive, but women just didn't. There was usually one car. The man usually drove. That was just what people did. And my grandfather got up from where he was and he said, let's go. And she said, where are you going? And he said, you want the job? You got to be able to drive? We're going to teach you to drive. And he taught her how to drive. And she got huge back then, to be in a 2-car home or family. But I share this with you because we really have to hold on to memory, because there is a group of people out there who want to alter the history, who want to malign the history, who want to change the history. And it matters very much. And so I say that as I watched my sister be, sworn in, I thought about how it's the 3 generations that move the needle. And can we imagine when there are 4 generations and 5 generations and 6 generations. Now, I respect deeply that some people don't feel called to college. My father did not have a college degree. My mother did. That was perfectly fine. But even though my father did not have a bachelor's degree, he valued education very much. And while people make fun of me because I grew up in Pepper Pike, my father did everything he could, I want you to hear this, to move his family to a community where education could not be withheld from us. The best education ever could not be withheld from us. My parents raised us to believe this. Education is the one thing no one can take away from you. And I'm doing similar with my own son. So we have to have that education because that education is part of the informed memory that fills it in. I may not know all the details of my family and how we got here and things of that nature, but what I do know is enough to then take books and courses and Ancestry.com and other resources that are available to help fill in and to make the story known and to hold it in memory. Next week, I don't know. I know we're definitely going to do chapter 15, which is the final chapter. It's on liberation. And then I hope that I might be talking with the author, Cole Arthur Riley. But as I explained last week, there was a scheduling change with her, and that's created a scheduling change with me. So we'll do our best. But if not, you'll be stuck with me. But you love me. I love you. It's all going down like 4 flat tires. I love you. Take care. Be blessed. I'll see you next week. Peace.